Okay, well, Martin, perhaps the first one is for you. Can you please update us on what's happening in regard to the attack on the ACL officers? Just a bit of, cloak and dagger stuff to start with.
Is this working? Yeah. Okay. So there was some activity on that front from our end, but those of you who haven't kept up with what's been going on, the attack's now, been in the past for a fair while. I think it was the 21st of December 2016. I won't go into all the details here because I could keep you all day, but we're certain that the investigation into that attack was completely inadequate. We know for a fact that, we have very strong suspicions that are well grounded, that it was politically motivated, and we were not treated well by those who were investigating that matter. And there was a number of things I could talk about which cast serious doubt on the whole process. For example, 2 days afterwards, Lyle and I went in to see I think it was the Deputy Commissioner in the ACT of the AFP's ACT unit, and we wanted to challenge the findings, and we said to him, "How did you make the finding?" And he said, "Look, it was through an interview with the suspect." We said, "Well, he was in intensive care in hospital." He said, "Yes." We said, "So he was conscious?" "Yes." "How long was the interview?" 7 minutes. "Okay, were you there?" "No, watched it on CCTV." "Okay. And you immediately made the finding it wasn't politically, religiously or ideologically motivated?" "Yes." "Okay. Well, will you do an investigation into this guy and the circumstances? Will you look at his computer?" And "Yes, we will." "Okay." And then I said, "Well, considering the range of things that could motivate somebody against ACL, whether it be religious extremism, political extremism, LGBT, whatever, is it possible that in that subsequent investigation you will find things that will cause you to change the finding that you've made?" And he looked at us both across the desk and said, "There is absolutely no way under any circumstance that the finding we've made on this matter will change." So that's but one thing I could tell you. We know many other things. We know that this guy was mouthing off about the ACL before he drove the van to bomb the office. We know it was a failed attempt. He wanted to detonate 6 cylinders, not 2. We know that on the night, a police officer was overheard saying, "We're going to kill this. It's going to go nowhere," by somebody who went down there. I rang and said, "Would you go down to the office and see what's going on?" Because there were some issues even early on. So all sorts of problems. So we wanted to do something about that. When the information came out about this person's political affiliations and their history, and also came out that in that 7-minute interview even, it was pretty clear that it was somebody who didn't like the ACL. We wanted to report that to the Commonwealth Ombudsman and have an investigation into the investigation, so to speak, and also the possibility of a coroner's referral because it was a fire, or they reported it as a fire, which firstly meant that we got insurance on the building because it wasn't an act of terror, and secondly meant that it qualified for a coroner's investigation. So we're going to do both of those things. However, then tragically and sadly, the guy committed suicide effectively this time. So we just had to let it go. It's just too hard to deal with the optics of that when somebody's killed themselves and then we go along and say, well, we're going to pursue this matter further. So we let it go, and we've just had to do that. We are now in a situation where we're just contemplating whether or not we try the Ombudsman angle again. We'd have to have a pretty good justification for not pursuing it sooner, but I think we have that in light of the circumstances. So it may be that we pursue it again. But it's a big problem, and it's very sad that it happened, and it's not a nice feeling when you don't get the support of the police on these matters.
Okay, thanks, Martin. Just a question here. How many churches openly align their support with ACL, and how can the wider body of Christ as individuals rally behind ACL for godly values? How many churches openly align? That's perhaps a question for Martin again. Yep.
I'm happy. I'll take them all. No worries. Look, we have a candid relationship with most churches. I put it that way. So we could never say that we speak for churches. There's no formalisation of anything like that. It's just too hard to manage politically. It's too difficult. So what we do is we tend to meet with the leaders of many denominations We have meetings with different denominational leaders. We often get access to see the Prime Minister or the opposition leader and take a delegation of leaders in. And really, in that leadership collection, nearly all the denominations are represented. To be honest, the only ones that we really don't have on side are the Uniting Church, but we do have the confessing congregations aspect of the Uniting Church on side, and the Anglican Church outside of the Sydney Diocese. But otherwise, we have enormous support, I would say, but enormously good relationships right across, practically across the board. And we do very often use that support to collaborate, whether it be a meeting with a senior politician or whether it be during the marriage campaign, a letter on same-sex marriage signed by all of those leaders and therefore the vast majority of the church in Australia. We do use that to collaborate, but we'll never have a system where we officially say, oh, we're the peak body and we speak for you. That's just way too hard. And it's just not, there's a whole range of reasons why it wouldn't work.
This is an interesting question. I'm not sure who to direct that to. As a public librarian, I'm concerned about drag queen story times being introduced into the normativity of library service. What can I, as a Christian, do? Yep. Elizabeth, you want to give that one a go?
The second... Am I on?
Yep.
Right, okay. The second part of that is harder to deal with than the first. I agree with you. Drag queen story time. Crazy stuff. There's a headline that I saw in it called "What in the Name of Captain Kangaroo is going on?" And really, it's insidious because drag queens look like clowns to children, don't they? So it's sort of appealing and visual, but what they're standing for is horrible. I wish I had some visuals to give you. You know, hairy armpits and gloves and, you know, full beards and flowing gowns and things. It's absurd. But what it's trying to do is normalise transgenderism. So we're taught to think that the T in the LGBT movement is one sort of monolithic thing, but it's not. There's a lot of different behaviours and identities lurking behind just the T in transgender, and part of that is the drag queen stuff. I think it's a very small minority of people who are advocating for that. So I think your voice as a librarian saying "not in my library" is excellent. Libraries are one of the areas where the activists are really trying to get in to children in terms of stacking books. You know, there's a lot of The Boy in a Dress. There's a lot of these sorts of the Gender Fairy book. These stories that are aimed at moulding the understandings of children. I have some mothers who are activists, and they're quite funny, but they tell me that they go into public libraries and they steal those books and they shove them down the back of the science books where no one's ever going to find them. So there's a sort of, you know, quite a lot of disruptive activism that you can do in that way, which I'm all for. I think that's really, really good. They're going to play dirty. But I also think that local councils are one of the areas where we're not active enough, and that's actually the engine room of the other side. So just contacting your local municipal council and saying, I object to these books being in my library. These are my taxpayer dollars being spent, my ratepayer, to indoctrinate children in these terrible things. So even getting involved in local councils is a really important area, and it's one that we don't do very effectively, or we haven't really emphasised that a lot, but it is a really important tier of government to concentrate on.
Yeah. Okay, anybody want to comment on what Christians can do about that? Further on that? No?
Very, very quickly, I know I'm hogging, but just quickly, I think one of the most important things we can all do on these issues wherever we are is get informed, get informed, get informed, get informed. Because the most important thing to do is when these issues come up in your context that you can actually speak. That's really vital because people are not informed. They don't know about Walt Heyer's story. They don't know about the rate of transgender suicide. They don't know the issues. If you're informed, you can be a voice, and it's important that it's more important than ever that we are all that person.
Perhaps this one could be for you, Nick. What's the status of the Safe Schools program and its implementation in Western Australia? If a parent or child is not happy with what's taught in health ed, how should they go about raising it?
So it's still it's in some schools in Western Australia. The state government made a commitment that it would be available in any school that wanted it. And they have set aside a significant amount of money for that to be rolled out in those particular schools. So it's not universal, and so if it is in your school, then the standard practice should apply. You should start by communicating your concern with the principal and escalating it from there if needs be. But it always helps if there's more than one voice. So if you can find a few friends who share your concern, then that will add weight. I unfortunately have to say, I think if one parent goes to the principal, it's probably not going to be that effective. But if a group of parents do, then you probably stand a reasonable chance from the principal's point of view, who's most probably not passionate about this particular issue, and there's plenty of other things to do in running a school that are a higher priority, and probably would be quite happy to dispense with it just to save a bit of peace.
It's probably worth just also mentioning that there's a lot of other programs that are not known by the name of Safe Schools, which are being pushed into our schools. So just be aware of that and check out what your kids are actually learning and address that. The next question is one that probably all of us may be interested in, is the resources that informed the talks here today. It's a lot of the facts, statistics and so on. Where can we access those for enabling us to engage with others? So Elizabeth, as Director of Research, where can people look?
In a paper that I'm about to produce. We're trying to make this stuff available. It's just a question of digging into, someone asked me this at lunchtime, where do you find your sources? And really I just read in the media and look at where they've got their information from, and then go back to those primary sources and examine that. So it's just tedious scholarship, but that's actually what good scholarship is about, is going back to the primary sources and checking out whether or not the information really stacks up. So it's very time consuming and laborious. The pornography paper that is out there has quite a lot of references in it, and I'm working on a paper at the moment which will cover Kinsey and basically the problems with the science as far as the born that way narrative goes, as far as transgenderism goes. Why might parents hesitate to affirm an LGBT identity for their child, and then relating that then to Australia's policies and some of the things that are coming out of Melbourne as well. So including what La Trobe believe. So I'm afraid it's not all in one convenient place at the moment, but I am working on that. So some of it will be available on ACL's website, but we're working on making more of that available in an easy format. But it's quite a long process. I'm sorry about that.
Branka, perhaps you could comment on the euthanasia side of things.
Yep. So the Hope website, which is noeuthanasia.org, or if you just Google Hope No to Euthanasia, you should get to the website. So that's got a lot of fact sheets on it that were prepared last year for the Victorian and the New South Wales campaigns. You can also go to the government. I was referring to the government sources. If you Google Oregon data health statistics, it'll take you to their Death with Dignity page, which they then just have full disclosure of what's happened in the previous year. Belgium also does publish their stuff, but it is in a different language, and it takes a little while for it to get translated. So probably I'd go to the Hope website first, and sorry I didn't have a slide today with the actual address, but it's noeuthanasia.org.
Good. And I would also suggest Nick's report.
Yep.
I'm sure there'd be plenty of arguments there that you can rely on, and also the ACL website has some material on it as well. So, Dr. Google is extremely helpful, but it's important to discern what is fake news and what's real news.
I can just can I just add one other thing?
Sure.
Just in terms of useful websites to look at on the whole surrogacy issue, and whether or not the outcomes for children are the same from different types of families. There's a really good website called Them Before Us, where a lot of that research has been organised. It's in the US. Katie Faust is behind that, but there's some good sociologists, Catholic sociologists, who are working. So for different areas, you'll find different organisations that specialise in those things, and that's a good one to mention.
Yeah. Actually, the interesting thing is there's lots of information out there. Just on the one about parenting, for example, when I was an MP, we had we could get a uni student to do a project for us, and I asked the uni student to do a project to look at the Australian research on the outcome for kids depending on the type of family they've grown up in. And the student was of the view it wouldn't make any difference. I said, look, do the research, see what... And he was utterly convinced that biological mum and dad in married relationships is absolutely clear. The research is so overwhelming that is actually the best outcome for kids. And yet, Bill Shorten said he was offended when somebody said that. But the facts are very, very clear. Okay, let's go to the next question. How do we rally the younger demographic? And they put they're under 65. No, they actually put 18 to 25. The ones at uni and going into the workplace. How do we enter into the social media arena and conquer it? That's probably for all, eh? How do we get the younger generation? I've made the comment when I look around, there's great to see some young people, but there's mainly people with less hair than me and with greyer hair than me even. So we do need to work on that. Who would like to tackle that?
I've got one suggestion anyway, because I, dabbled my toe in the social media water over the whole marriage campaign, and I'm fairly appalled at the low level of thinking that there is, of critical thinking out there. And one of the things that I took away from that was we need to teach the country how to think again, and that doesn't mean just telling them what we think and giving them conclusions. And so just throw this out there as an idea for, it's quite a non-confrontational way of leading people on a journey. And I tried it out on the subject of surrogacy with my little lefty group of friends who don't know I work for ACL. Most of them wouldn't talk to me if they did. These are like high school friends that are on social media. And so I just started asking questions about surrogacy. So who's in favour of surrogacy? And of course I got all the Christians going, oh, it's terrible, it's terrible. And I'd write them little personal messages saying, I know what you think and I agree with you, but I'm not going to respond publicly. And then eventually I said, so no one's in favour. And then a few people came out of the woodwork and said, oh, well, I've got some gay friends and it's worked out well for them. So then you ask the next question, because this is what good teachers do. They ask questions. And then when people come up with the answers, they're their own answers. They're not your answers that you've told them and you've hammered home a message. You've actually made them think. And so I have one friend who's just all heart and no brain, bless her. But And I was saying, so is it different then if you sell a child before it's conceived or if you sell a 2-year-old? And if so, why? And so she struggled to answer that. And then I gave these people names and I developed the scenario. And in the end, the mother was Tanya and the poor little boy was Humphrey. And in the end, I just had her saying, oh, poor Humphrey. And I thought, yay, I've won, because now she's got there. So it's not always having the facts and the statistics to slam the opposition. And actually what we need to do, and this is what I actually think Jordan Peterson does really well, is he engages with people in an open, honest way that is interested in finding the right answer. It's not interested in demolishing the opposition or showing you how stupid you are, but actually teaching people to think. Because the people who are engaging with you on social media, they're not the only ones, they're not your only audience. The real people who you are speaking to are off to the side, just observing and thinking for themselves. And they're the people who you might have a bigger influence there than you ever really would understand just from the conversation.
Anyone else like to comment?
Yeah, as the token young person, I'll say something. There's a few things. So I'm actually doing a lot of work in this space at the moment because I am young, still in my 20s, and so when I speak and when people discover me, they go, "Oh, you're young, and we have young people. Quick, come and talk to our young people." That's happening a lot, because there's it's an open field essentially. There's not that many people in it, so that is happening. The other thing that we are doing at ACL is we're in the process of putting together a new communications platform. It's a big project, it's going to take time, and it's very taxing for people to have to produce the content like me. But we definitely are moving into the social media world, and the idea is through alternative media, social media, etc., to effectively engage at a young person level through the same means that their heroes engage with, like Jordan Peterson, like Ben Shapiro, like these guys. And I'll just say that as a general principle. Oh, there's LMI as well, by the way, so the Lachlan Macquarie Institute, through the programs they're running. There's a big community of young people coming out of that. Some of them are here today. Some of them, work for MPs and so on around the country. That's really making inroads, and that's getting inside people's heads and putting them on the trajectory and bringing them into the community. But back on what I said before, As a general principle, I think younger people are looking for heroes and examples. That's what they're after. And in the church for a very, very long time, especially those involved in youth ministries, have tried to be their friend, have dressed like children, behaved like children, and wanted to come alongside them. That is not, let me repeat, that is not what my generation and below want. They want examples, not friends. And not only do they want examples, not friends, they want truth, not conversations. And that is why someone like Dr. Jordan Peterson, who speaks the language of truth, who actually says truth, who is bold without compromise, but is a wonderful example, actually, in his life and his behaviour. I mean, you have people commenting, young guys commenting on his YouTube videos, if you just look at them saying, Jordan Peterson's my dad and all this kind of thing. And you see actually that one of the crises for young people is they don't have examples. I realised recently when someone was asking me about mentoring, etc., and who do you talk to? And I said, well, my dad. And then I realised how unusual that is. I have a very, very close relationship with my father. I speak to him several times a week. And that is unusual. They don't have fathers. They don't even have often mothers that they can rely on. They have people who want to come alongside them but not lead them. And it's really, really important that we understand that change. Because as soon as I think the church starts to be much bolder, starts to be much less compromised, and starts to speak with less apology, I actually think young people will realise it stands for something and will follow on. And that is my desire, is that we actually stand in that space. And the problem with those that do stand in that space is they're not Christians. And if you delve down into their deepest presuppositions, you look at Jordan Peterson, for example, I mean, it's Jungian psychology. It's archetypes and this kind of thing. It's not good ideology at its core, although at the surface it looks very much like what we believe. And so we need Christians who are Christian right through to the core, standing in that space, doing what he is doing. And I think there's a number of people that once we get that in our heads, we can go forward and at least try and give the resources that young people need in the church once again. The other thing I'll say is that we need to understand how young people think. And this is what Jordan Peterson's really good at. I think at about the age of 35, there's this gulf, or it's woolly between 30 and 40, but there's younger and older, very drastically different ways of thinking. Older, there's somewhere banging around in the back of their head, Judeo-Christianity. Younger, somewhere banging around in the back of their head, postmodernism. And the two don't meet. And the sooner we, as those with the Judeo-Christian mindset, understand the postmodern mindset, the easier we will engage with it. So start reading material, watch Jordan Peterson for that purpose, and read Stephen R. Hicks' Understanding Postmodernism, and get inside their head so you can engage with them.
Good. Thank you. Nick, I think this is one for you. How can you get around the office staff to actually get to talk to an MP?
Look, that's a fair question. It's a fair question, and it's just going to be variable depending on the MP and the staff, the topic that you're going to raise. So I would describe myself actually as a pretty inaccessible MP. Now, one of the reasons for that is because I've, of course, got wonderful staff, but I pretty inaccessible in the sense of that I'm very particular about what I'm going to devote my time to, and because there's just so much to do, and it can be overwhelming at times. And so, look, if somebody's coming to tell me that they're in a dispute with their neighbour about the fence, or the dog's barking too loud or something like that, I'm not going to meet with this person. Now, I can get away with that a little bit because I'm a member in the Legislative Council. Probably if you're in the Legislative Assembly and you're in a marginal seat, you wouldn't be able to get away with that, and you'd need to talk about dogs and cats and fences and so forth. So it really does depend on each MP. All I can encourage you to do is to persevere, number one. Number two is, if you do email, at some point it's going to come across the eyes of the MP. Now, you may not get to meet with them personally, but they're still going to know about it. So each MP will have a system. The system might be that the electorate officer meets with the MP once a week and says, look, this is the correspondence that we've come in, and they deal with it in that fashion. So they'll at least know about it if they haven't actually seen it with their own eyes. Persevere.
Yep. Good. As a lower house member in a marginal seat, anybody who rang my office got an appointment to see me. But that's why I was working 80 hours a week for 8 years, so that's probably why I lost a lot of hair. But anyway, that's good. Lost that one. How do we get doctors on side to help the babies born alive after an abortion? I guess we could expand that a little further, Nick, to not just doctors but nurses. Is there some way of getting the medical profession, I guess, on board with this?
The medical profession are very closed, generally speaking, on this particular issue. So on the euthanasia issue, they're actually very good. And they're not closed at all. I mean, if anything, they're all quite open. So they're either very loudly opposed to euthanasia or very loudly in favour of it. And a significant majority of the medical fraternity, of course, are opposed to euthanasia. But on abortion, there's a different culture, different mindset, I find, with the medical practitioners, and it's very much closed shop. So I have had the opportunity to speak to some, but very quietly, behind the scenes, not in a public forum. I've certainly never been on a panel with a medical practitioner in that sense. So it is. There's just something about the culture when it comes to abortion. People just don't want to talk about it. And look, frankly, that's the same with the members of parliament. And you will have seen in that inquiry that I spoke about earlier that even then they haven't even completely done the job properly. So they've done a half job, maybe. I probably wouldn't even give them 50% for that. They've done a third of the job, really. And the previous committee that we had look into this issue, well, they did about 1%. So it's very, very hard to just crack through that resistance, that paralysis. There's a real paralysis when it comes to abortion. So how do we get the medical guys on side? Look, I don't actually think we need them on side. I think the facts speak for themselves. I don't need a medical practitioner to sit next to me to explain to people that a West Australian baby, a citizen, has the same rights as any other baby or citizen. Actually, that's a matter of law, nothing to do with medical practice. So I'm just asking for the medical fraternity and the Department of Health to follow the law of Western Australia. So the only way you're going to get exposure on that and see change is if the members of parliament are prepared to hold them to account, because ultimately they are the overseers of that particular stream of governance. So I think it's probably more the members of parliament that you need to be getting on board rather than the medical practitioners.
Fine. Good. A slight change of subject. Can you speak to the freedom of speech ramifications regarding the $68,000 bill for police services that was issued to Dave Pello's Axiomatic event in Melbourne? Anybody know about that? Yep. Perhaps Martin, if you want to tackle that one.
It's interesting. There's huge freedom of speech implications. In fact, I already know of some event organisers who have modified their event in Melbourne in the light of that. And it seems like the Melbourne Police or the Victoria Police are taking this on as a bit of a MO. It's the second time they've done it. And it's just curious to me. Well, actually, I wrote a blog on this. Is a difference of thinking about who victims are, really. It is victim blaming because these guys put on an event where it was completely lawful. Actually, the speeches were totally innocuous in the sense they were reasoned out, they were cautiously thought through. If you and I heard those speeches, I did go and look at some of them, there's nothing in there that really makes you go, wow, that's outrageous. Not at all. They're standing up for often Western civilization, often Judeo-Christian type values, and then freedoms and libertarian stuff as well. It's a political event. Now, because of that, you have Antifa and these radical organisations in Melbourne who decide to protest that event in a most unbelievable way, where the riot police have to show up, where they cause huge amounts of property damage, and it's ugly. I mean, I've been there when this is happening at ACL events. We had 2 events in Melbourne prior to this where protesters showed up in massive numbers, barricaded the entrances. Our people couldn't get in. They're screaming in their face, "Go home, bigot, go home." There's spitting, there's groping, there's all sorts of nasty stuff going on. And the police will show up, say 6 cops will show up. "Oh, gee, sorry, we're under-resourced, we can't help." So we had that. We didn't even get the riot police showing up, and about 80 of our people couldn't get into one of the events that we held. And to top it all off, in the middle of that protest on one occasion, there was a massive fight broke out. And there was people lying on the ground with blood coming out of their head and everything because they'd all started belting each other. And I thought for a minute, "Oh no, that's our people," and it wasn't. And we've had no help at all from the police, none. In fact, our Victorian State Director went in to see one of the senior police people there, and she just looked at him and said, "Oh mate, I've got footage of your people assaulting the protesters," and would not go any further because our people had to push through in order to get to the door. Totally unhelpful. And now on this issue, what they've done is these guys have shown up to shut down the event, to cause all this trouble, and the Victoria Police have not sent the bill to the troublemakers. They've actually sent the bill to the people who are doing the right thing, who are hosting an event. Now, that emboldens Antifa, and they're already basically using it now as a business model to try and stop anyone who's conservative, anyone who's Christian, anyone who's right of centre, to come to Victoria and hold events, because they now know that the police are on their side and the police will essentially not punish them for what they're doing. Now, this is the thing, it just is, again, the cultural Marxist postmodern thinking that's got right into a very important institution, which is the police. And the thinking says that the victim is the person without power, and the oppressor, the one who is guilty, is the person with the power. And if you're right of centre, or if you're Christian, or you're standing for Western civilization, that's power in the optic of the postmodern cultural Marxist worldview. So you're already the victim. You're already, the oppressor, and you are to blame, so they will bill you for what you've done. These people are just raging against their oppressors. They're oppressed, they're probably intersectional with all sorts of protected attributes. That's the way the paradigm's going, and you see that's how my generation's been brought up. That's how we think by default, even ones that have gone to Christian schools like myself, and now it's filtering through the institutions, and it's devastating. It is absolutely devastating. In fact, the whole ideology was only invented as a means to undermine Western civilization, and that's exactly what it's doing.
Thank you, Martin. Not very encouraging. Let's make sure that if anything like that were to happen in WA, that we'd certainly be onto it. Incidentally, the UWA, where Dr. Van Metter was going to speak, I was delighted that so many people wrote to the West Australian, and the uni got an absolute hammering for, I think it might have been one letter of semi-support, but it was just overwhelmingly letters attacking UWA. And if your letter wasn't published, don't be discouraged, because the editor tells me that when they get a stack of letters, they tend to pick the best one. So if you, even if yours isn't published, it helped to get another one published. So don't underestimate the importance of doing that. Now, this one's a little bit, I'm not quite sure I fully understand the language, so I may need some interpretation or explanation. Now in childcare, the NQS assess at ratings and CCSS intertwining, Christian operators losing access to funding. Is this a reality? Social grooming from birth. Anybody know anything about that? Otherwise, we'll just skip that one. There's too many acronyms in that.
Is this to do with daycare centres and how they're accredited? I was talking to somebody up in the Gold Coast who said that this actually isn't a new problem. She had an award-winning, she's pastor's wife, had an award-winning daycare centre, and every now and then the accreditors would come in and she'd have to go from room to room saying, "Don't call them boys and girls, no, shh, just stop it. And everyone would have to behave themselves for 3 days, and then the minute that the accreditors went away, they'd all relax and go, "Oh, thank goodness, come here, boys," and carry on as they always had. It's becoming more of an issue, this sort of rainbow accreditation that's needed in order to make sure you're a safe place. And in Victoria, for example, they have the rainbow tick accreditation program for aged care facilities. So this is just a gravy train for the LGBT rights movement. They have, qualified assessors who come in and they'll have a look at your establishment and they'll make sure that your policies or make recommendations where you need to change your policies in order to be rainbow friendly and retrain your staff. They've got the course, you have to pay for it, so there's a lot of money involved in this. And if you don't have the rainbow tick, then you get your government funding withdrawn. So this is just another means of totalitarian control to make sure that everybody who runs a business has to do it according to the rainbow ideology, and it goes into daycare centres as well. Fortunately, it's, how committed they are. I hope that they're all just as committed to maintaining that rainbow-friendly environment as my friend was up on the Gold Coast. But it is one of the mechanisms for sort of ratcheting down, rewarding people who adhere to rainbow ideology. And then, of course, you have to be checked out every 6 months. So, it's an ongoing funding source for them as well. It's a problem. I think it's definitely something that we need to concentrate on. And
Good. Thank you. Some Christians say they reject politics, in inverted commas. How would you distinguish, yet hold together, speaking the gospel and speaking up for freedoms? I think that English is not quite right there. I think the intent is, some Christians say they reject politics. How would you distinguish between speaking the gospel and actually speaking for freedoms?
So, believe it or not, I grew up in a church that rejected politics. So here I am. And there is a significant movement out there that is, these are the things of the world, don't get involved in politics, etc. Now, also I would say that evangelical churches tend to be on the spectrum of, we just talk about Jesus. We just preach the gospel. So we don't do anything about it. There's a curious sort of disconnect there. And what I often say, and so I do currently go to an evangelical church, and that has given me great opportunities in the evangelical world to speak. And what I think is that this is a reaction against a social gospel, the idea that doing good in the world is in fact the gospel, which is also wrong. But see, both of them I think are extremes because, and I often say, look, Mark and I talked this morning about the salt and light imperative, the doing good works and what all that means. I did an interview with Mark afterwards on camera which talked about the biblical implications around all of that. It's clearly in the Bible. But if you want to relate it directly to the gospel, it's very simple. Paul wrote a letter all about the gospel. It's called Romans. The thesis, he's a legal writer, he's got a great structure, and theologians agree the thesis for that letter is, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it's the power of God for salvation for all who believe, to the Jew first and also to the Greek, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. There's his thesis, and he goes on to explain it. Now, when he's explaining that, he doesn't stop at chapter 5, he doesn't even stop at chapter 8 or 12. He goes for 16 chapters. And in those 16 chapters, he talks about how the righteousness of God is revealed by faith in the gospel. 1, the righteousness of God in his wrath against sin, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3. Then the righteousness of God in Jesus Christ, particularly as it can be ours because of Christ, chapter 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then, by the time he gets to chapter 12, he says, therefore. And if you go through with a highlighter, chapter 1 to 11 of Romans, and you highlight every statement that's an imperative that says do something, there's only about 5. In fact, 308 of 315 verses contain no imperatives. It is just theology, theology, theology. He doesn't tell you to do anything yet. But then from chapter 12, it's like the sluice gates of imperatives open. Do this, do this, do this, because of what I've said. And for some reason people just draw a line on chapter 12 and go, that's my gospel or that's my gospel. And I'm sitting there going, wait a minute. That's the whole gospel, because it's now the righteousness of God revealed through the changed lives of Christians being worked out in the world in which they live. And if we're not including that in our gospel, we are disobedient. We are not doing what we've been asked to do. And chapter 13 occurs in that section, and it's all about how Christians relate to the state. It matters. And so I simply don't understand this binary. I think it's jammed into people at theological college and they can never shake it. But the simple fact of the matter is that you and I know the gospel. We need to know our theology, but we can't forget the therefore of Romans chapter 12, and we've got to go out there and do something about it.
Very well put. There's a question here that perhaps I should answer. It says, who are in the ACLWA team besides Peter Abetz? Are they here today? No, there's no one else. So come and join me and help me.
Let me say, so Susie Edwards is down the front and John Zung's up the back on the camera. They're from National Office, but the WA team is Peter Betts' director and the National Office resources all of the state directors, okay? So we very much work together, and there's 30 staff, just under 30 staff nationwide.
Yeah, I was going to say, if I need a media release done, I can flick that off to a few dot points to Abby in Canberra, and then within an hour, I have a beautifully crafted media release. Or if I want to send out an invitation for an event that I'm running in WA, I'm pretty hopeless at making things look pretty on the computer. I can flick that over there, and they bounce it back to me for approval. So there's a great support team in Canberra. But in terms of the face, if you don't like the look of my face, you just got to put up with it. So that's the answer to that one. Yeah. Is it against the law, now that same-sex marriage has been legalised, for a conference such as today to still talk against it? Who's going to tackle that? The lawyer, Nick, or the lawyer?
The simple answer is no, and don't let anyone tell you otherwise. And there's a number of reasons for that, not the least of which there is no explicit law in place, certainly not in Western Australia, but to my knowledge nowhere throughout Australia, that would explicitly exclude you from being able to do that or prohibit you from doing that. But secondly, we do have a implied freedom under our Australian Constitution to political expression. And I think that Martin might talk about this. There's a couple of cases before the High Court, particularly around the abortion exclusion zones issue. And I'm watching that with interest to see what the final outcome is there. But no, absolutely, you can have a conference like this. Unfortunately, there will be pressure from time to time, and there's already been discussion earlier about that UWA case recently. That's going to happen. What happened in Victoria there, that's outrageous. But you have to be bold. You absolutely must insist on your right to speak and to debate and to think. And the day we stop doing that, well, then you can we've lost already the fight at that point.
Good. And a question to you, Brenka. What can we learn from the euthanasia debate that took place in Victoria that might be helpful for us here in Western Australia?
Good question.
Now, you've got less than half an hour, okay? No.
I think I've got 3 minutes.
Yeah.
Oh, gosh. I guess you have to focus your attention where it can make a difference. And I think Nick was saying, really, it's the upper house that is where the fight's going to be. The lower house is so overwhelmingly Labor that if you want to make sure you push your resources, it should be in the right place, which is the upper house. Get the medical professionals in front of each person in the upper house. Get meetings with them. If you know people in contacts, get them to go and meet with them personally. Not just send them letters, but those doctors need to go and sit with them. And as has been said, just need to write to their politicians directly. Make sure that everybody who has a strong view about this makes their view known.
Excellent. On your website, there'd be also some things, I assume, that could be useful.
Well, we're hoping to set up a campaign for the WA issue where we can also facilitate the letters to all the relevant members.
Excellent.
So we'll keep you posted.
How many minutes have we got?
1 minute.
1 minute, 48 seconds. One time for one more question. A question that might be useful for all of us. Question here is, what sort of membership can people take in ACL? Yep, that's yours, Martin.
Well, actually, I'm going to answer that in a minute because I'm wrapping up.
Okay.
So Hold that thought.
Okay, hold that thought. Excellent. Okay. I think we've just about covered the questions. Have I missed any? We have Christian schools in this state allowing students to have a prayer meeting, but no Bible allowed. Doesn't sound like a Christian school to me. But anyway, how do we re-engage with education? Nick?
It does sound very odd. So whoever's asked that question, if you want to come and speak to me later, I'll be happy to chat about that. But look, at the end of the day, as I said earlier, with regard to the safe schools things, get in touch with the principal and go there with a group of, we're going to have a bit of a mob mentality sometimes when it comes to these things, because that's what they constantly do to oppress our view of the world. And not that we're interested in oppressing others, but in order to have power behind your voice, it is useful to have a few people get together. So if there is a Christian school that doesn't allow a Bible in a prayer meeting, then I think a few of the Christian parents who send their kids to that Christian school should say something to presumably the Christian principal.
Yeah. Very good. Okay. Well, on that humorous note, we'll wrap this up, and thank you very much to the panel for answering the questions. Thank you.